Employers of Reddit, what is one thing someone has said or done in an interview that made you want to hire them on the spot? Story 1. One of friends was given blank sheet of paper in an interview and asked to retito some with it. Instead of writing drawing on the paper, he tore it in small pieces. When asked why he did that, he replied that paper was problem given to him and he wanted to make it into small, manageable problems. He was hired instantly. No more questions asked. Story 2. I was hired for a job on the spot once because of an answer to the question, why should we hire you over the other applicants? I said because I'm smart enough to learn the job and smart enough to know that an engineering degree doesn't mean I know anything about construction. I know when it's time to shut up and listen. Dude interviewing me was the head engineer, but the guy who had the power to make the decision was an old-school construction dude who basically hates engineers. Story 3. A guy walked into my office and told me he wanted a job as a security consultant. I put him in charge of his own team. Why? Because he shouldn't have been able to get all the way to my office on the 11th floor without an appointment or employee badge. Story 4. My mother, sometime in the 70s or 80s, applied to an advertised position in a hospital to be a nurse. She rocked up on time and was sent into the head honcho's office for her interview. The man sat quietly as Mom rattled on about her history, how her mother had been a nurse, her training, etc., and she came across extremely confident. After she finished, the man sat for a moment, then said, "Well, you sound like a wonderful applicant, but I'm afraid we're not hiring." Confused, Mom explained that she had seen the advert in the paper, to which the boss pointed out that she was looking for the hospital across the road. This was a psychiatric ward. Bursting into tears, Mom asked if he could write her a note explaining that she had not been late to the interview and that she had made an honest mistake. The man grinned and said, "I'll do you one better. They'll give you a job. TLDR, interview for job in wrong hospital. Gets a job anyway." Edit boss guy was actually the director of nursing. Mom's now watching over my shoulder. She's fascinated that so many people are interested in her story. She also says, "Hi, Reddit." Story 5. I wasn't in charge of hiring, but near our waiting room are some storage shelves. I had to put some large boxes of files that were waiting to move to an off-site facility. There was someone filling out an application and waiting for an interview. He put the clipboard down and started to help me, dressed in his interview suit. I can tell when someone is trying to do something to be recognized, and when somebody is doing something that is just second nature. He was the latter. It was just that these need to go on the shelves. Let's do it reaction. I told the hiring manager about it. He got hired, and I was right. It's like when you know someone sees you and they don't hold the door or elevator. You just told me a lot about yourself, and you don't even realize it. Edit commas are my friend. Story 6. I read all applications thoroughly. An applicant once listed that he used to tend a water buffalo and listed Mother Teresa as a reference phone number 000-000-0000. That got my attention. We called him in for an interview, and he's been one of the best guards that I've ever had. Story 7. When I was younger, I applied for a seasonal job at an electronics store. During the interview, I made a joke about stealing the manager's car. I don't recall why I would have done that, and he hired me on the spot. Apparently, he liked my sense of humor. Story 8. I was doing a group interview for kids who wanted to work for Cold Stone Creamery. The last of 5 questions that everyone answers is "Sing me something." I love that question. It quickly divided the kids into kids that wanted the job and kids who were here because their parents made them. One time I asked it, and without a moment's hesitation, this big guy starts belting out "My Heart Will Go On." Seriously, they could hear him in the parking lot outside. On top of that, he's terrible. I don't think he hit a single note, but so much confidence. The hiring discussion was basically, well, obviously Titanic guy. Anyone else? Story 9. Work as an economist for major bank. Didn't look at any of the applicants' resumes, had someone else do that. I was looking for someone to build a model for me that a competitor was using. The project would entail constructing a model similar to X that Y normally uses. Are you familiar with it? Interviewee: Yes, I built it. Let me draft up an offer. Story 10. I was applying for a job as junior engineer at a small company. During the interview, the engineering manager brought in a couple of their other developers to ask me some questions. It turns out I had previously worked with one of the guys in our college's engineering computer lab. He apparently vouched for me because the engineering manager offered me the job as I was walking out of the lobby. That's when I figured out networking was going to be the best tool in my career development. TLDR, I just knew a guy. Story 11. I knew I was interviewing against people who were much more mature in their careers and have 10 years of experience. I also had just read an article about how confidence projects competence. Not that I felt incompetent, but I knew that if I leaned on words like "I think I'd be good at," or "I feel like I really," instead of more assertive, declarative statements, I might blow my first impression. I also had extremely specific examples for every question. I was unafraid to answer the weakness question or to talk about my mistakes and how I learned and improved from them. I had literally spent 10 hours researching the company's industry, even downloading white papers and referencing the statistics and data in my interview. Finally, I treated the interview like a sales call. I dug into what challenges and pain points the CEO had. They had mentioned that one of their strengths is that they could do quick iterations and improvements to the product, and I asked how they currently educate their current customers on these new features. He sighed and told me that that is one of their biggest struggles. I told them about my upselling experience from the past, and I got hired on the spot. TLDR over preparation, extensive research, specific examples, and understanding the company's challenges got me the job. Story 12, I was told I got my job based on my cover letter. I recently got rejected for my dream job. I was working part-time at 2 demanding jobs that paid all, and just fed up the second I got home. I wrote the most sarcastic, joking cover letter I could to the first job advertisement I saw. Apparently, it was a huge hit at the office. I got 2 interviews, and with no skills or qualifications, I was hired because that stuff can be taught. Honest, open attitudes can't. Since then, I've been promoted twice, and I run my own department. Story 13, I was interviewing for my first job after college. Interviewer interrupts me and says, "Sorry, my foot fell asleep." So I pull out the old Stephen Wright joke. That's too bad because now it's going to be up all night. I called my dad right after I left, and I could hear him facepalm through the phone. Story 14, when I worked at KFC, I interviewed a guy that had just been fired from McDonald's. He told me how said he had just had a kid and was kicked out of his house. The fact that he was completely honest with me was impressive. He promised he would not make the same mistake working for me. I took a chance on him, and he wound up being one of the best employees I ever had. Edit, I should clarify, since a few have asked, I say had, because we both moved on to better things. This was back in the early 2000s. P.S. Thank for the gold, kind stranger, Rev Jeremy Duncan from a notable take a pastime. This link appeared. Story 15, my boyfriend's mom is the one who conducts the interviews at an advertising company. When they were looking for a new secretary, the owner put a lot of emphasis on finding someone memorable. When one applicant was asked at the end of the interview if they had anything else to share, she replied with, "Well, I have a pet pig." So of course she got the job. Story 16, non-employer, but back in 2002, I was hired because I was the only one who showed up for an interview, and I apparently really impressed the supervisor. I'm still working for the same company today. Story 17, I hired an artist based on a web cartoon that she drew in college and never showed to me. She didn't think it appropriate. I found it by Googling her name. Story 18, told this once before, but I once hired someone for giving me a dirty look in an interview. I'm an IT service line manager and was hiring a desktop tech. I had a sample scenario where I asked if given this and this piece of information, if you could connect a desktop PC to our domain. The correct answer was yes. 2 applicants fidgeted a little bit and said they might need a little practice, but thought they could eventually figure it out. The third big brash country gal looked at me like I was insane. I hired her on the spot. Story 19, I was in an interview for a camping store and educated the manager on sleeping bags. He had no idea about them before I told him. He hired me on the spot. Story 20 was interviewing for a job in software documentation. Made it through the one-on-one with the boss, and then had the group interview. When breaking for lunch, the boss asked the question, "What project management strategy do you use to juggle projects with conflicting deadlines?" With no hesitation, I shot back, "Chaos theory." Got the job. Another time I showed up an hour early for the interview. This was pre-GPS, so I was not sure how long the trip would take. The boss did not suffer fools gladly, so he finished the first interview in 10 minutes. I was next up. When the boss started to close the interview, I told him that my interview was actually due to start in 10 minutes. So I had a 145 interview in an hour time slot. The job was writing about engineering software, advanced manufacturing techniques, CAD, statistical QA, stress analysis, and many other topics. My work history matched every single requirement, and I had examples of completed projects. So I was going to be paid to play with computers and software and tell other people what I had learned. Got the job. As a side benefit, I learned to always meet deadline. Story 21, for a job I had back a couple years ago, I had an employer ask me what I would do if I was driving a car and came across an elderly woman, my best friend, and the girl of my dreams all at a bus stop in the rain. I assume based on what choice you make, they are able to tell something about your personality or what kind of morals you have. Without much hesitation, I responded I would give the keys to my friend and have him drive the elderly woman home while I kept the girl of my dreams company. He started laughing pretty hard, and I received a phone call with an offer the same day. Story 22, I was brand new and just off my first contract in software development and going for a state job. The 2 guys I was interviewing with were older but great guys. We got done about 10 minutes early, and the one guy said that I meet all requirements and most likely get the position. But if I could give him a riddle he couldn't solve in that 10 minutes head, cancel the rest of the interview's 2 guys that were overqualified, I found out. I get a piece of paper off the printer and drew 7 parking spaces in a row. Asked him to find a way to put 10 cars in the lot. This was before the internet, and this one was still rather hard. He couldn't get it in time. I finally gave him the answer, and they gave me a start date. TLDR, interviews are fun. If I don't enjoy the interview, regardless of if you want to hire me, I won't be taking that job. The riddle: draw a 7-car parking lot on a piece of paper, and now try to put 10 cars in those spots without overlapping. The answers 10 cars. Story 23, interviewer gave me a glass of water that contained half of its volume. He then proceeds to ask me, is it half empty or half full? I drink the glass of water, put the glass down, and say, problem solved, insta job. Story 24, not me, but a former trainer I had in my company. For the interview, he was asked to create a guide on how to train the interviewers for any topic. He brought in a loaf of sliced bread, peanut butter, and jelly. He trained everyone in the room firsthand how to make PBJS. He got hired because when they happily asked why he chose that method, he told them to pat their heads and rub their tummies as he rubbed his head. Everyone rubbed their heads in error, and he said that's why, because I could tell you, or I could show you hands-on. He was everyone's favorite trainer for the length of his job. Story 25, I was personally hired this year, and informed it was because I actually read the sign that said employment applications here, instead of asking where they were. Story 26, I mostly see if the guy I am hiring is a pushover or brave enough to stand his ground. Some employers don't like it, but I feel it's a very important quality to have, especially in today's market. I saw this attitude in a person who we hired when I was new too. He had gone to a client who was refusing to pay up on time. So he basically just coolly sat in his office till the owner agreed to meet him. Later, when the owner again told him to come back later when he was free, he straight out shamed him in front of his whole staff and told to pay up or don't ever show his face in our office. The owner client was a dude in his late 50s. He later came to our office the same evening to talk to our boss about his behavior, though at that time scolding him in front of the client and promising repercussion. We later commended him for that attitude, which got our payment on time. Story 27, I was in an interview with the VP of my now department when this happened. He was looking over my resume and making small notes to himself. After other interview failures, I knew the first 2 things he would ask about. I've been working as a project engineer for an outsourcing firm that supported a jet engine company. I also had a degree in anthropology. Believe it or not, that weird combination of work experience and education made it incredibly difficult to land a different job. I could already see red circles around my degree and my job title. The entire time we're making small talk about the house I just bought, about his flight and flying habits, about the interview schedule, that sort of thing. Eventually, he asked the first real question of the interview, why do you think you can work in energy after working in jet engines for 4 years? Without thinking, I just said, why do you think I was able to work in jet engines after spending 4 years in anthropology? The interview basically stopped after that, save for a couple questions about my ability to use a computer program that had landed me the interview in the first place. After the hour ended, he and I went outside and talked a bit more. He said they would get back to me after the last interview on Friday, which was the next day. Monday morning, I was told I had the job at $5K and a week more vacation to start than I had requested. Story 28, during the interview, I asked the employer, where do you see me working here? This puts the image of you working in their business into their head. Got hired on the spot. Story 29, doing the job. This has worked for me as an interviewer and interviewee. Just roll up your sleeves and get to work, or demonstrate that you have. The most important characteristics of an employee are respect, conscientiousness, and a strong work ethic. Everything else can be taught. Story 30, my friend's boyfriend was accepted into the nuclear engineer program for the Navy by answering this question Q. What's the greatest challenge you've experienced in life so far? And my greatest challenge in life was not knowing what I wanted to do with my life until I realized this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. He had to wait 5 minutes in the waiting room before they came out and told him he was accepted into the program. Story 31, I showed up about 15 minutes early for an interview at an office building and started chatting with the elderly receptionist while I filled out random paperwork. Made her laugh a few times, then went for the interview, which I thought went so-so. On the way out, she asked how it went, and I talked to her for another minute before getting in the elevator and leaving. Afterwards, sent the thank you note for the interview and continued to apply at other places. 2 days later, I got the job, and on my first day the following Monday, I found out she was the wife on the company's founder who passed away, and she had been working there for over 40 years at the front desk. She told them to hire me after I left. Story 32, this one candidate came in and was bleeding passion and energy, knew the company up and down to the smallest detail, and lived for the work he did, fluent in English, admitted what he knew and did not know, and used the word super-duper extremely when talking to the IT director. He was hired because he wanted to be there more than any of the other network engineers. Best hire ever. The rest was learn on the go and with training, retained because of a consistent grin when working with the things he loved. Story 33. I once hired this guy who had pink hair sleeves and a huge nose gauge cause he said he had another job at a tat shop. I wanted free tats. Afterwards, I found out the guy only did piercings, and he scared away my customers and stole money. But he did bring around goth sluts, which I also hired and had with repeatedly in my office till the business went under. Story 34 had several very qualified applicants, was trying to decide. One of them called me and said, "Why don't you try me out for a couple of weeks? Unpaid internship. When you decide you like what I can do, we make it permanent." He worked for a few days unpaid. Then I hired him full-time and paid him for the days he worked unpaid. That's the kind of confidence I admire. Story 35, not an employer, but the manager at this retail store eyed me up and down, and his first question was, "Do you play MTG?" I replied no, but I always wanted to learn. Then his follow-up was, "Can you start right now?" So yeah. Story 36, unfortunately the guy was I didn't want to hire him on the spot, but he did do something interesting. When it was his turn to ask questions, he asked us, "What do you think of me?" or something like that. It caught me off guard. Then I had to figure out how to politely say you sucked. Had he been qualified otherwise, this might have come off as impressive enough to give him the job. My answer would have been, "You got the job." Most of the time, I get people disappointing me. After a string of interviewing bad candidates, I wrote this thing, 5 reasons you're unemployed. You may find some pointers in there. Story 37, I went to a local restaurant to drop off an application. The kitchen manager had some free time, so he pulled me back to interview me. While we were talking, they had a flood of people walk in. Rather than standing there watching, I walked over to the dish area and started doing dishes. Job was for a dishwasher. The rush ended an hour later. The kitchen manager offered me the job at 5.50 hours. Minimum wage was $4.25. Story 38, my mother was once offered a job on the spot when she was told there's only X number of jobs going in the interview, to which she replied, "That's fine. I only want the one." Story 39, I can see you have no background in data analysis. How did you figure out how to correctly perform a somewhat complex task in Excel? Well, I Googled it. Immediate self-sufficiency. Story 40, my boss asked me to logically deduce the number of teachers in our country. I work with statistics, so that was a viable question. I got very close to the actual number. Half a year later, he told me that this was the kicker to hire me. Story 41, I was being interviewed for a pathology lab, and my last name is frequently mispronounced as an organ that they see quite a bit. They all thought it was hilarious, and clearly that was a sign that I was meant to work there. Story 42, when I was being interviewed for my current job, the store manager said to me, "I see you worked at a game store during high school, so do you like games?" "Yes, I love games," I replied. He then asked, "So what would you say is your favorite type of game, and why?" I answered the question with complete honesty, not realizing that my response would be the primary reason I was hired. I said, "I absolutely love strategy games. I love them because you can't beat the game by memorizing some button combination. It's never the same game twice, so I'm always having to think on my toes and come up with new game plans." After I got hired, he told me that was the answer that sealed the deal. Story 43, not an employer, but I was hired on the spot at my current job. Because of my extensive knowledge of Firefly Serenity, the boss said, "You're smart, and you're someone I could talk to on a slow day. Want the job?" Story 44, bit technical. I was the interviewer, and I was asking the candidate a question to find duplicate characters in a string C language. The guy says he would have an array initialized to 0 and simply loop through the string and use the ASCII value of the character to index into the array and increment. Correct. So I asked, "What is the size of the array?" He said 25, number of English alphabets. I asked him to repeat himself. He froze, but still he said ID, just do Z. I thought the recovery was spectacular and recommended a hire. He was hired. TLDR candidates forgets how many alphabets are in English language, but recovers spectacularly and gets the job. Story 45, sort of off topic, but might help someone land a dream job. So I thought I'd share. Many years ago, I filled out an application for a bench worker at a plastic injection mold shop because an elderly gentleman I knew retired from the shop, knew I was new in town and looking for a job, and told me they might hire me for the open position. In the space on the application where I was asked to list other skills, I put drafting. They hired me as a draftsman instead of a benchman. I was ecstatic. Story 46, starting out, I had many interviews that went crazy ways. I had an interview with a much older gentleman who offered me a cigar or cigarette. Of course, I declined. Then he pulled out scotch and poured me a glass. I accepted, but never drank it. He asked if I drank or smoked, and I replied, "I don't smoke, and I only drink to wind down, so I wouldn't do so." In this instance, I didn't get the job, but that was just a really weird setup. Not sure what he was expecting. I have other weird ones too if there's interest. Story 47, when I was working at Domino's in my teens. A guy came in asking for a job and application. Dude had no shirt on, baggy pants, and 2 blunts behind his ears. One was half smoked. Now granted, 90 of us were potheads, but we weren't blatantly walking around with blunts behind our ears shirtless. Story 48, I once went for a job interview, and there were about 15 other people there to interview for the same job I suspected. On the wall was a piece of paper which said applicants with arrows below, pointing to the various chairs to sit. I sat across from the sign, and I just started staring at it while others fiddled around and lightly chatted. The receptionist was calling people back one at a time, but rather than thinking about when my turn would be, I kept staring at the sign until I had that quick aha moment. I walked over to it, took a piece of paper, and covered the letters TS, so it then read applicant. I then covered 2 of the arrows, except for the one pointing straight down. I then sat in the chair below it. I noticed the receptionist staring at me, and she got up and went into the back. A few moments later, she came out with a man, the hiring manager I later discovered. He introduced himself to me and asked me to come back. We chatted a bit, and he asked what made me change the sign from applicants to applicant. I just told him we all have our moments of pure clarity, and that it just felt like the thing to do to set myself apart from the others. He chuckled a bit, and then offered me the position. Story 49, I remember a long time ago when I was involved with interviewing entry-level help desk staff. At that level, almost every candidate has identical experience fresh out of school, maybe worked on relatives' computers, etc. We honestly don't expect them to know anything and are more trying to get a feel for their personality and soft skills. Their gut instinct is to try to convince you they know more than they do, which gets a little old, because they typically can't speak intelligently about anything involving technology. We had one guy who worked at McDonald's as a shift manager while he was in school. When we got to the part where we asked about overall work experience, his face lit up when he talked about his job. He told us how much he liked training new staff, finding ways to be efficient, and especially how much he liked seeing his regular customers every day. Every other candidate glossed over their current non-IT jobs. He also seemed smart and had a nice personality, but we all took note of how proud he was of his fast food job, and he immediately went to the top of the list. We hired him, and he worked out really well. I think he also continued to work at McDonald's on weekends for a few years. Story 50 applied for a highly sought-after teaching job, asked what lessons I did, and told them I had the students write protest songs about the AR. I then proceeded to rap my entire example song I had made for my students, hired the next day. Story 50, the manager that hired me liked my confidence, but liked my better. I'm being serious too, because when she called me telling me, when to start she told me straight up I liked her answers and attitude, but of course one of her employees at the time was a good friend of mine, but he still tells me to this day that he mentioned nothing about my sense of humor, and how I love that. She is a manager at another of our stores, and I have since become a manager, and she continues to tell me she loves my PS. She's a lesbian and I'm a dude. Story 52, when Sharper Image still existed, I got a call from Ray the manager after I left an application, but never interviewed. Anyhow, he thought I was someone else, and so had me start in the stockroom right away. He thought I was awesome at it, and that he made the right choice. At the end of the shift, he says, "Great job, Dave." I said, "I'm not Dave, I'm 13-inch mushroom maker." He said, "Meant to hire the other guy. A job as yours was applying for an IT job at a major credit card payment processing facility." HR asked me, "If you could be a tree, what kind of tree would you be and why?" I answer, "A money tree. And the reason is obvious. I was hired that next day. Story 53, I will take slightly longer to learn the ropes than an average person here, because US is a new work setting for me. But I have the desire to learn, the willingness to try new things, respect for work and like challenges. I will also ask a bit more questions in the initial phases, only because I am new. Boss, can you start next Monday? It's been wonderful 4.5 years so far, and several promotions and awards. Story 54, I always hired farm boys. They get out of bed in the morning and don't mind working late. A guy can be brilliant, but if he's not there, what good is that? Story 55, late to the party, but I was hired on the spot for a retail job, not difficult. I know after interviewing with an assistant manager. One of the interview questions was one of those, "Tell me about a time you went above and beyond." I told the story of how ID had a clean smeared off of a bathroom wall at another job in my first week. I described consistency, color, how we found it, everything. The store manager didn't even bother interviewing me. As she said, that was the best answer she'd ever heard. Story 56, during an interview for a serving position at an Italian restaurant, I was asked to what type of wine I enjoyed. My palate was not so refined at the age of 19. So I told the true Franzia in a solo cup. Hired. Story 57, I got hired on the spot for my first job in high school. It was a fast food place. I literally handed the manager the application, and she hired me without even looking at it. Apparently, she was the only chick working there at the time and wanted a friend, LOL, when she got fired a month later for sleeping with an employee. I was the only chick there for the next 2 years. Story 58, I was part of a group interview that was split up into smaller groups and interviewed. I was later told by our interviewer that he picked me because I was honest about my modest work experience, mostly retail, compared to the many that seem to have years of work experience and more degree certifications. Several like this still got hired. Mind you, the interviewer related to having that kind of modest background. I suppose this wasn't getting hired on the spot or sharing something unique clever, but I figured ID shares sometimes it's just about taking a chance with individuals. The job was for Tier 2 IT support. I get lots of compliments, and many coworkers say I'm one of the better techs, even over those with more experience certifications. Story 59, I used to ask this question at every interview. Do you consider yourself to be an organized person? Everyone says yes. I follow up, but can we go look in the trunk of your car? Most people would stammer and hesitantly say yes. I never ever actually went to anyone's car, however. One guy says, thinking quickly on his feet, I drove my wife's car today, hired him on the spot. Story 60, I was once hired on the spot because I loosely quoted Edward Albee. What separates man from animals is not the use of tools. It's the desire to create metaphor. We're the only species that shows ourselves to ourselves. We intentionally crest beauty to remind us of beauty. Story 61 gave a guy a technical problem on the fly that flummoxed my fellow colleagues on the interview panel. Only one guy managed to do it. Hired him without question. Story 62, the first job I ever got was at a little Chicago-style hole-in-the-wall kind of restaurant in high school. Whenever we had half days, we would go and eat there. I always asked the guy who owned it if he was hiring. He always asked me if I was 16 yet. So the day I turned 16, I rode my bike over to the restaurant and waited for him to show up to open up for the day. He showed up and said hi and asked what I wanted. I asked if he was hiring, and he again asked if I was 16 yet. I answered yet today. He invited me in, walked me to the back, and gave me an application and pretty much started telling me how my work schedule would start, training, and all the good stuff. Probably one of my top 5 best days ever, also best job I've ever had. Story 63, not an employer, but right after college, the interviewer asked me, why does a college graduate like you want to work here for $10 an hour? I answered, I don't, but if you hire me, I promise I will stay for a minimum of 6 months. I was there for 9 months before I found a much better job. Story 64 applied for a job at a car dealership. After the usual questions regarding strengths and weaknesses the manager asks if I have anything to add, I asked if the person who had previously done the job I was applying for was a human. He said yes. I answered, then I can do this job. 3 years later, I'm still here. Story 65, opposite of hired. But this dude came into Spencer's Gifts years back. I was the supervisor on duty and asked for a job. He explained it's been hard for him to find a job because of his tattoos. So I asked him, what tattoos are you referring to? And he puts his fists side by side, and a heart symbol waffles is tattooed across his knuckles. Yes, waffles, not waffles. His application went straight into the shredder. Story 66, I cannot honestly say there was ever any one thing. It is usually more about attitude and how you carry yourself. Confidence is king, but not cocky. The last question I used to ask everyone that I interviewed was pirates or ninjas. Whatever they said, I would just nod my head and under my breath say, uh-huh, and walk them out the door. Story 67, not exactly an employer story, but still relevant. My last job was a software development job with an induction heat treatment company and was probably the worst job I've ever worked. I basically had to manage a team of 2 other software developers as an intern and making far below what I had made at the internship I had worked the year before. The main problem being that my boss thought he knew how to manage software development and really had no clue. I worked my butt off to nail down a software spec and implement it from the pile of generated code red that was left with us by the previous employer. Most of what we did was a major hack job, simply because the software was too large to redo from scratch, but was already way behind schedule. Just after getting my first raise offer, which still didn't put me on par with my earnings the year before, I decided to look for a better job online. The first job opening I found was for a senior software engineer managing web applications at a sheet music company. The name caught my eye. I had been in band for at least 6 years, from the end of grade school to the start of high school. Then a bit more in college. I was very familiar with the brand, as I'm sure anyone else in school bands or orchestras would be. After giving my old boss my 2 weeks' notice and informing him of my intentions to leave for an interview during a workday, I drove over to the new place. They knew I was technically competent, I could communicate well, and I cared about the company. Despite not being able to work the position I was interviewed for, they decided to hire me on as an intern in the same position. I've now been there for over a year, and I've been given a nice raise and an offer of full-time employment when I graduate.